What led to the temple then being rebuilt despite the opposition that happened? Well, it begins first and foremost with the preaching of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. In Ezra chapter 1 and chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, "Now the prophets Haggai," same Haggai as wrote the book of Haggai, "and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Jerusalem and Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. And then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem." Now, no doubt at the instigation of the Samaritans, the governor, Tattenai, the governor of the province of beyond the river, and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: "Who gave you a decree to rebuild this house and to finish the structure?" And they also asked this: "What are the names of the men who are building this building?" But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until reports should reach Darius and an answer be returned by letter. Well, anyway, Haggai and Zechariah began the process, preaching the need to rebuild the temple. Those are also prominent themes in the book of Haggai and the book of Zechariah, if you begin reading those books. Also, you have the governor, Zerubbabel, and the high priest, Joshua, who was behind this movement. And to make a long story short, even though the regional officials sent letters to Darius questioning whether or not the Jews had the right to rebuild the temple, it turned out that Darius's officials went through the records and found that decree of Cyrus allowing them to rebuild the temple, and sent back a letter saying that yes, they do have permission to rebuild it, and so they do. And so this then completes Ezra 1 through 6, and let's now look at Ezra chapter 7 through 10. The story now jumps ahead nearly 6 decades to 458 BC in Ezra chapter 7, the 7th year of Artaxerxes, as chapter 7 verse 7 dates it. And so in between chapter 6 of Ezra and chapter 7 of Ezra, there's a long time period, and it's during that time period, by the way, that the whole story of Esther occurs. It occurs in the reign of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, who was the father of Artaxerxes, as described in Ezra chapter 7. But anyway, this describes the story of Ezra, who was a scribe of priestly heritage, who was also an expert in the law of Moses, as you'll see in the verses, Ezra 7, 1 through 6, and Ezra 7, verse 10. And this Ezra got permission from the Persian king Artaxerxes to return from exile. And he came with others from Babylonia to Jerusalem to teach the law of Moses to the Jewish people. The text actually records the decree of Artaxerxes, where it says, "I, Artaxerxes, the king, make a decree to all the treasurers beyond the province of the river, whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the God of heaven, requires of you, let it be done with all diligence." And huge amounts of silver, 100 talents, and a talent is about 66 pounds, and other supplies were given for the purpose. Moreover, he is given permission to teach the law. And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom your God of your God that is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God. So not only was Ezra given permission by King Artaxerxes to return from exile, but he's also given permission to teach the law of Moses to the Jewish people and to judge them by the Jewish laws. You have something similar in some parts of the world where, for example, in England, in Great Britain, they allow Muslims to operate under Sharia law under certain limitations. So, in order to maintain order, no doubt, the Persian king Artaxerxes is allowing Ezra to enforce the Mosaic law. Again, this is the second return from exile. He comes back in 458 BC under Artaxerxes I, Longimanus. And the decree was as many who wish could return, and there were finances given out of the royal treasury to pay for this. And this is a smaller group that came, about 1,500 men, 38 Levites, and 220 helpers, for a grand total of 1,758 people. And as we'll see in a moment, one of the major problems that Ezra is going to address is the problem of intermarriage between Jews and pagans. The third return from exile will be under Nehemiah, that's described in the book of Nehemiah. So Ezra's accomplishments: he reinstituted the Mosaic law as the law of the land of Judah. Again, Artaxerxes allowed him to appoint magistrates and judges to judge the people according to the law of your God and the law of the king. So it had to be both and rather than either or, but the Mosaic law, the law of your God, became the law of the land in Judah. And Artaxerxes, no doubt, was looking for societal stability in a distant part of his realm, whereas Ezra wanted God's law to regain its rightful place among God's people. Now, his major accomplishment, in addition to reinstituting the law, was fighting against the practice of mixed marriages with pagans among the Jews. If you look at Ezra chapter 9, it describes this problem. Ezra chapter 9 and verse 1, after these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves, and for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. And in their faithlessness, the hand of the officials and the chief priests have been foremost. And as soon as I heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak and pulled my hair from my head and my beard and sat appalled. And then all who trembled at the word of the God of Israel because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles gathered around me while I sat appalled until evening. Ezra went on to pray a prayer of confession, confessing his people's sin. Ezra said to God, "O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this day we have been in great guilt. For our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hands of the kings of the land, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as it is today." He goes on to conclude, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who's practiced these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there would be no remnant nor any escape? O Lord, the God of Israel, you are just, for we are left a remnant that has escaped as it is today. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this. Now, Ezra not only prayed about the problem, he then took actions. He took actions against the practice by convincing 113 Jewish men to divorce their foreign wives. He was encouraged by a man named Shechaniah, who encouraged a covenant to be made that these people put away their wives according to the counsel of my Lord. And Ezra followed through with that. And Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel take an oath that they would do as had been said. And it lists 113 Jewish men who actually followed through and divorced their foreign wives. Now, this is a little hard to reconcile with some of the New Testament statements about divorce. The Old Testament allowed divorce under certain circumstances, sexual immorality, and certain other cases. Abraham divorced his wife Hagar. Slave wives sometimes were to be let go if they were not treated decently. You'll read about that in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 21. But here it was at a key point of salvation history that if they didn't take action, there was a danger that the entire Jewish population would assimilate into paganism and cease to be Jewish. Look at some theological themes in Ezra. One, God's providence and faithfulness to his promises. God stirred up Cyrus to fulfill Jeremiah's prophecy. And even though Cyrus did it for his own selfish motives, it accomplishes God's providential purposes, working in and behind and through this pagan leader to fulfill Jeremiah. Two, the importance of godly leaders. God led the people through people like Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, Zechariah, and Ezra. And it's important to have godly leaders in the church as well. God leads through people like these. You have the centrality of worship for the people of God. It was vitally important that they rebuild the temple as the center of Jewish worship, as God had directed through prophets like Haggai and Zechariah. Worship is important in the life of believers. Another theme, the need for God's people to be under God's revelation. Ezra sought to get God's people to be under the law of God, not just the law of the Persian king. And so even under the new covenant, we don't follow the law of Moses, but it's still right for us personally in our society to be under a higher authority than merely human laws. There's the expectation of opposition, both at the time of the first return, described in Ezra 4 through 6, and later at the time of Xerxes and Artaxerxes, as you'll read about in Ezra chapter 4. Jews received political opposition in trying to obey God, and we can expect the same. 2 Timothy 3:12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. There's the importance of the prayers of confession of sin. Ezra did this for his entire nation in Ezra chapter 9. We could confess our sin and the sin of the church and the sin of our society as well as we follow his example. And then there's the problem of mixed marriages in Ezra 9 and 10. The spiritual harm of marriage to unbelievers or being unequally yoked together, as Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 6:14, is great. Christian young people need to be careful to marry Christians who share their values rather than unbelievers.